If you've ever noticed that someone in your life slowly disappeared, not with a dramatic argument, not with a final explanation, but with silence, fewer messages, fewer visits, fewer replies, you may have wondered what really happened. At first, it can look cold, maybe even selfish, but in many cases when someone cuts everyone off, it's not an act of rejection toward others, it's a form of protection toward themselves. And what's interesting is that most people who reach this point didn't start as distant people. They were often the opposite. They were the reliable ones, the ones who listened, the ones who stayed calm when others were overwhelmed, the ones who showed up even when they were tired. And for a long time, that role becomes part of their identity, until something quietly starts to break inside. Because the psychology behind cutting everyone off rarely begins with anger. It usually begins with exhaustion, not physical exhaustion, identity exhaustion. Over time, many people unconsciously develop what psychologists describe as a social mask, a version of themselves designed to keep relationships stable and expectations satisfied. It's the role of the responsible one, the peacemaker, the stable friend. At first, this role feels natural, even rewarding, but slowly a subtle shift happens. People begin relating to the role more than the person behind it, and the individual starts feeling less like a human being and more like a function. You might recognize some of the small behaviors that appear during this phase. You overthink texts before sending them. You avoid saying certain things because you know it might disturb the dynamic. You listen carefully to everyone else's problems, but when it's your turn to speak, the conversation somehow moves on. None of these moments seem dramatic on their own, but psychologically they accumulate over months, sometimes years, until a person reaches a quiet realization. They are present in people's lives, but not truly seen. And this creates something psychologists sometimes call identity fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from maintaining a version of yourself that no longer reflects who you actually are. At that point, many people begin pulling back in subtle ways. They respond later, they stop initiating plans, they choose silence over explanation. From the outside, it looks like distance. From the inside, it feels like survival. Because relationships operate on something deeper than time or proximity. They operate on emotional energy. In healthy connections, that energy moves both ways. But in some relationships, the flow becomes one-sided. One person becomes the listener, the stabilizer, the emotional container. Psychology sometimes describes this pattern as the wounded healer dynamic, people who feel valuable primarily when they are helping or supporting others. And at first, this role can feel meaningful. But over time, something subtle happens. Their usefulness becomes expected, their presence becomes assumed, and when they try to show their own vulnerability, the response often feels strangely uncomfortable or absent. This moment, when someone realizes they are valued mostly for what they provide, can be deeply disorienting because it forces a painful question. Were these relationships built around connection or around utility? And here's where it gets interesting. Most people assume that cutting everyone off is about confidence or independence, but the real reason is often much simpler: control. When someone has spent years adjusting themselves to maintain harmony, disappearing can feel like the first moment of psychological autonomy. Not because they hate people, but because distance is the only place where they can finally hear their own thoughts. If this explains something for you, there's more to uncover. We explore patterns like this regularly. Another important layer of this behavior is biological. The nervous system is constantly scanning social environments for signals of safety or threat. When relationships repeatedly feel draining, unpredictable, or emotionally extractive, the body can eventually trigger a kind of protective shutdown. Researchers studying nervous system regulation describe this as a survival mechanism designed to conserve emotional energy. In simple terms, the system decides connection is too costly right now, and withdrawal becomes the body's way of resetting. This is why many people who cut others off report something unexpected: relief. Not happiness, but relief. The silence feels calmer than the constant negotiation of who they are supposed to be. And this leads to one of the most misunderstood aspects of social withdrawal: the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is psychological starvation, wanting connection but not having it. Solitude, on the other hand, can be something very different. It's an intentional quiet, a space where external expectations stop shaping your identity. For someone who has spent years reading emotional weather in every room, adjusting their behavior to keep relationships stable, that quiet can feel strangely restorative. Of course, this stage is not always comfortable. In fact, it can be deeply confronting, because when social noise disappears, something else appears. Your own thoughts. Feelings that were postponed for years begin to surface. Anger, grief, disappointment, sometimes even resentment, not necessarily towards specific people, but toward the life pattern that formed around them. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the moment when the shadow emerges, the parts of the self that were previously suppressed to maintain social harmony. And this stage changes how someone sees relationships going forward. They become more selective, more cautious, sometimes even quiet in new social settings, not because they dislike people, but because they no longer want to lose themselves inside a role again. And there is one more psychological trigger that often accelerates this process: betrayal. When trust breaks in a relationship that once felt safe, a close friend, partner, or family member, it doesn't just create pain, it restructures the way the mind approaches connection. The person no longer sees relationships through the same lens of innocence. Instead, a deeper form of discernment begins to develop.
Psychologists call this an emotional cutoff, a protective distance created to prevent further psychological harm. From the outside, it may look harsh, but internally, it feels like the only way to preserve what remains of the self. If this resonates with you, you are not alone. You can share your experience in the comments if you feel comfortable. Sometimes putting these patterns into words is the first moment they start making sense. What's important to understand is that this phase of withdrawal is rarely the final destination. It's more like a psychological transition, a stage where someone moves from living according to external expectations toward discovering their own internal direction. In psychology, this process is sometimes described as individuation, the slow development of a self that exists independently from social roles. And that process often requires distance, not permanent isolation, but enough space to ask questions that were impossible to hear before. Questions like, who am I when I'm not fixing everyone? What do I actually want when nobody expects anything from me? And which relationships feel safe enough for the real version of me? Interestingly, long-term psychological research has found that happiness is not determined by the number of relationships we maintain. It's determined by their quality and emotional safety. In other words, a few honest connections often provide more psychological stability than many relationships built on obligation or performance. So, when someone cuts everyone off, it doesn't always mean they're rejecting connection. Sometimes they're rejecting the version of themselves that existed inside those connections. And the silence that follows is not always emptiness. Sometimes it's the beginning of clarity. Just something to reflect on. Take a moment to notice whether any part of this pattern feels familiar to you. Understanding often comes before change. And if this kind of psychological reflection resonates with you, you're welcome to stay. There will be more conversations like this.